The wound on his shoulder had turned the color of rot and poison, and Emma May knew before her horse even stopped that the mountain man standing in the doorway of that rough-hewn cabin would rather die than let her near it. She had ridden 3 days into these mountains with nothing but her medical bag, a bedroll, and enough supplies to last a week. The telegram that reached Roswell, New Mexico had been brief. Mountain man injured, refusing help, situation desperate. The mining camp foreman who sent it had offered her $50 just to try. Emma was 23 years old and had been practicing medicine alongside her father since she was 16, taking over his practice entirely after he passed 2 years ago. She had seen men lose limbs to stubbornness, watched infection steal lives that could have been saved with a simple cleaning and bandage. She would not let it happen again if she could help it. The man in the doorway was easily 6 feet 4 inches tall, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle, even as he leaned heavily against the doorframe. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, tangled and unwashed, and several weeks of beard covered his jaw. His eyes were a startling pale blue against his sun-bronzed skin, and they watched her approach with the wariness of a wounded wolf. His left arm hung useless at his side, the shirt torn away to reveal a gash that ran from shoulder to mid-bicep, the edges inflamed and weeping. "You can turn around and ride back where you came from," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I did not send for you." Emma dismounted, her split riding skirt making the movement easier than a regular dress would have. She tied her horse to the post outside his cabin and pulled her medical bag from the saddle. "Jacob Hendricks sent for me," he said. "You have been up here for 3 weeks refusing to come down to the camp for treatment. Jacob needs to mind his own business. You are his business when your injury affects the mining operation." Emma walked toward the cabin, her chin raised. "I rode 3 days to get here. The least you can do is let me look at it." The mountain man shifted, blocking the doorway more fully. Up close, Emma could see the fever-bright glint in his eyes, the way sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool October air at this elevation. "I said no, and I heard you. I am looking at it anyway." Emma stopped just outside arm's reach. "You can let me do it while you are conscious and cooperative, or you can pass out from that fever and I will do it then. Either way, that wound gets cleaned and stitched before infection kills you." Something flickered in those pale eyes. Surprise, maybe, or grudging respect. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her practical clothing, the way she held her medical bag, the determined set of her jaw. Finally, he stepped back, the movement costing him visible effort. "Xavier Brennan," he said. "If you are going to poke at me, might as well know my name, Emma May." "And I do not poke." She stepped into the cabin, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. It was a single room, surprisingly well built, with tight chinking between the logs and a stone fireplace along one wall. A rough bed sat in one corner, a table and 2 chairs near the fire. Furs and hunting tools lined the walls. Everything was neat and orderly except for the pile of blood-stained rags near the bed and the distinct smell of infection that hung in the air. Xavier moved to the table and sat heavily in one of the chairs, his jaw tight with pain. Emma set her bag down and opened it, pulling out clean cloths, a bottle of carbolic acid solution, her needle and catgut thread, and a bottle of laudanum. "How did this happen?" she asked, moving behind him to get a better look at the wound. "Bear." Emma paused, her hands hovering over his shoulder. "A bear did this, Grizzly. 3 weeks ago, up near the high pass. I was checking my trap lines and surprised her with cubs." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "Got my rifle up in time to save my life, but not before she got a piece of me." The wound was worse up close. The initial tearing from the bear's claws had been bad enough, but infection had set in deep. Emma could see the telltale red streaks spreading from the wound site, the yellow-green discharge that meant purulent infection. She pressed gently around the edges and felt Xavier tense beneath her fingers. "This should have been treated immediately," she said quietly. "Why did you not go down to the camp? I take care of myself." "You are doing a poor job of it." Emma soaked a cloth in the carbolic solution. "This is going to hurt a lot. You should take some laudanum first." "No laudanum." Xavier's voice was firm. "I keep my wits about me." "Your wits are not going to help when the pain makes you pass out. I have had worse." Emma doubted that, but did not argue. She had learned early in her medical practice that some people needed to maintain control, even when it hurt them. "At least drink some whiskey. You have whiskey, I assume?" The corner of Xavier's mouth lifted in something that was almost a smile. "In the cupboard." Emma found the bottle and poured a generous measure into a tin cup. Xavier drank it in one swallow, then gripped the edge of the table with his good hand. "Get on with it." She started with the carbolic solution, cleaning away the dried blood and discharge. Xavier's breathing hitched, but he made no sound, muscles rigid beneath her hands. The wound was deep, the tissue damaged not just by the initial injury, but by weeks of improper care. Emma worked methodically, flushing out the infected matter, trimming away the dead tissue that had turned black at the edges. "You are going to have a scar," she said, more to fill the silence than because she thought he cared. "I have plenty already." Emma glanced at his arms, seeing the truth of that statement. Old scars crisscrossed his forearms, pale lines against tanned skin. The life of a mountain man was hard and dangerous. This man had survived it longer than most. The cleaning took nearly an hour. By the time Emma finished, Xavier's knuckles were white on the table edge and sweat soaked through his shirt. But he had not made a single sound of pain. She threaded her needle with practiced ease. "The stitching will hurt worse," she warned. "Just do it." Emma placed her first stitch, drawing the torn edges of flesh together. Xavier's entire body went rigid, but still, he made no sound. She worked as quickly as she could while maintaining precision, each stitch neat and even. 17 stitches to close the deepest part of the gash, then smaller stitches along the length where the bear's claws had torn through. When she finally tied off the last stitch and cut the thread, Emma realized her own hands were shaking. She had treated terrible injuries before, but something about doing it here, in this remote cabin, with this stubborn man who refused to show pain, had affected her more than she expected. "I need to bandage it," she said, her voice sounding strange in the quiet cabin. Xavier nodded, his head bowed. Emma could see him trembling now, the adrenaline and effort of staying silent catching up with him. She worked quickly, wrapping clean linen around his shoulder and upper arm, securing it firmly but not too tight. "Done," she said, stepping back. "You need to rest now. The fever should break in a day or two if the wound stays clean." Xavier lifted his head, and Emma was startled to see grudging respect in those fever-bright eyes. "You are good at that. I should be. I have been doing it for 7 years." Emma began cleaning her instruments, dropping them into a pot to boil. "You need to keep that bandage clean and dry. I will change it tomorrow and check for further infection." "Tomorrow?" Xavier's brow furrowed. "You are staying? Did you think I rode 3 days just to stitch you up and leave immediately?" Emma moved to the fireplace and hung the pot over the flames. "I need to monitor you for at least a week to make sure the infection does not return and the stitches hold." "I do not need monitoring. Xavier Brennan, you nearly died from stubbornness. You absolutely need monitoring." Emma turned to face him, hands on her hips. "Now, when did you last eat a proper meal?" He stared at her for a long moment, and Emma had the distinct impression he was not used to people telling him what to do. Finally he said, "Yesterday. Maybe the day before. I will make something." Emma looked around the cabin, spotting supplies in rough wooden boxes. "You have salt pork and beans, I see." "That will do. You do not have to cook for me. You just had major surgery. You are not cooking for yourself." Emma found a pan and started preparing the meal, comfortable in the domestic task despite the strange circumstances. Her father had raised her alone after her mother died in childbirth, and she had learned early to manage both medical practice and household duties. Xavier watched her move around his cabin, his expression unreadable. Emma could feel his gaze on her and found it unsettling in a way she could not quite name. She had treated hundreds of patients, many of them men, but none had ever looked at her quite the way this mountain man did. "Why did you become a doctor?" he asked suddenly. "I am not a doctor. I am a medical practitioner." Emma stirred the beans, adding water to keep them from burning. "Only men can be doctors officially. But I learned from my father, and after he died, the people of Roswell needed someone. So I stepped in. The town lets a woman practice medicine?" The town was not in a position to complain. The nearest actual doctor is in Santa Fe, 2 days away. Emma sliced the salt pork, adding it to the pan. "Besides, I am good at it, better than the last doctor we had, who was drunk more often than sober." Xavier made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Fair enough." They lapsed into silence. Emma cooking and Xavier watching. The sun was setting outside, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple through the cabin's single window. It was beautiful country up here, wild and untamed. Emma could understand why a man might choose to live alone in these mountains, away from the noise and complications of town life. When the meal was ready, Emma served them both on tin plates. Xavier ate slowly, as though his body had forgotten what appetite felt like. Emma watched him carefully, looking for signs of worsening fever or disorientation, but he seemed stable for now. "I will sleep outside," Emma said when they finished eating. "I have a bedroll." No, Xavier shook his head. You take the bed. I can manage on the floor. You are injured and feverish. You are not sleeping on the floor. I am not taking the bed while a woman sleeps outside my cabin. They stared at each other, both equally stubborn. Finally, Emma said, then we will both sleep inside. You take the bed, I will sleep by the fire. That is the compromise. Xavier looked like he wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was creeping over his features. The ordeal of having his wound treated, combined with weeks of poor sleep and fever, was catching up with him. He nodded once and stood, moving to the bed with careful steps. Emma banked the fire and spread her bedroll on the floor nearby. It was not the most comfortable arrangement, but she had slept in worse places. She had once ridden out to a homestead during a blizzard and ended up sleeping in a barn while she waited for a difficult childbirth to progress. Emma? Xavier's voice came from the darkness. Thank you. Emma smiled, even though he could not see it. You are welcome. Now sleep. You need to heal. She listened as his breathing gradually deepened and slowed, falling into the restless sleep of fever. Emma lay awake for a long time, watching the firelight flicker on the cabin walls and thinking about the stubborn, infuriating man who would rather die than accept help. She had seen many types of pride in her years of practice, but Xavier's was different. It was not machismo or foolishness. It was something deeper, a fundamental belief that he needed to rely only on himself. Emma understood that kind of self-reliance. She had been forced to develop it herself after her father died. But she also understood that sometimes survival meant accepting help when it was offered. She fell asleep determined to make Xavier understand that before she left these mountains. The next morning, Emma woke to find Xavier already up, trying one-handed to build up the fire. She rose quickly from her bedroll. What are you doing? You should be resting. The fire needs tending. Xavier's movements were stiff, his face pale, but his eyes clearer than yesterday. The fever had broken during the night, as Emma hoped it would. Then let me do it. Sit down before you tear those stitches. Emma guided him to a chair with a firm hand, then took over the fire. She put coffee on to boil and examined their food supplies. I brought some provisions with me. I will make breakfast. You do not have to keep cooking for me. I know I do not have to. I am choosing to. Emma mixed flour and water for simple pan bread, which she cooked alongside more salt pork. The domestic routine felt oddly comfortable, even in this rough cabin far from civilization. After breakfast, Emma checked Xavier's wound. The bandage had stayed clean overnight, and when she unwrapped it, she was relieved to see the stitches holding well with no signs of renewed infection. The flesh around the wound was still inflamed, but that was normal for the first few days after such an injury. It looks good, she said, applying fresh carbolic solution and clean bandages. Xavier had tensed when she started working, but he seemed more prepared for the pain today, his breathing controlled and steady. You are healing well. Keep this up, and you will make a full recovery. How long until I can use the arm properly? A month, maybe 6 weeks before full strength returns. You cannot do any heavy work until those stitches come out in 2 weeks. Emma secured the bandage and stepped back. Which means you are not checking trap lines or chopping wood or any of the other things I imagine you normally do. Xavier's jaw tightened. I have work that needs doing. It will have to wait. Unless you want this wound to tear open again? Emma met his eyes steadily. I did not ride 3 days and spend hours stitching you up just so you could undo all that work through stubbornness. I am not stubborn. You absolutely are. Emma started cleaning her instruments again, a necessary routine after every treatment. You nearly died from it, in fact. I would have been fine. You had septic infection spreading through your arm. Another week, and it would have been in your blood. You would have died, Xavier, and there is nothing you could have done about it alone up here. Emma turned to face him, her expression serious. I know you pride yourself on self-reliance, but there is a difference between being independent and being foolish. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying her face. Finally, he said, You do not hold back, do you? I learned early that patients need honesty, not coddling, especially stubborn ones. Emma allowed herself a small smile. Besides, you seem like the kind of man who would see through any attempt at gentle persuasion. I am. Xavier stood, moving to the window to look out at the mountains. I have been up here alone for 5 years. Got used to not depending on anyone. Why did you come up here? Emma asked. She knew she was prying, but something about this man intrigued her beyond simple medical interest. Xavier was silent for so long that Emma thought he would not answer. Then he said, The war. Emma understood immediately. The Civil War had ended in 1865, just 14 years ago. Men had come home changed, broken in ways that had nothing to do with physical wounds. Many had headed west, seeking something they could not name in the empty spaces and wild places. "You fought?" she asked quietly. 3 years, Tennessee, Georgia, Virginia. Xavier's voice was flat, emotionless. "When it was over, I could not go back to what I was before. So I came here." "What were you before?" "A farmer. Had a small place in Missouri, planted corn and raised hogs." He shook his head. "After the war, I could not stand being around people. The noise, the talking, the constant presence of others. It felt like the walls were closing in. So I sold everything and headed for the territories." Emma absorbed this, pieces of Xavier clicking into place. The self-reliance, the isolation, the deep need for control. He was not just stubborn. He was a man who had survived something terrible and built a fuft around making sure he never felt helpless again. "Do you like it up here?" she asked. Xavier turned from the window, and for the first time, Emma saw his expression soften slightly. "I do. It is quiet. The work is hard but honest. The mountains do not ask questions or expect things I cannot give. It sounds lonely, sometimes." He moved back to the table, sitting carefully. "But it is the kind of lonely I can manage." They spent the rest of the morning in companionable silence, Emma tending to small tasks around the cabin while Xavier rested. She washed the blood-stained rags in the stream behind the cabin, hanging them to dry in the October sun. She inventoried her medical supplies, making notes about what she would need to replenish when she returned to Roswell. She checked on her horse, brushing him down, and making sure he had enough forage. When she came back inside around midday, she found Xavier standing at the stove, trying to pour coffee one-handed. The pot was heavy and he was struggling, his injured arm unable to help balance the weight. "Let me help." Emma crossed the cabin quickly, taking the pot before he could spill boiling liquid on himself. "I can do it." But Xavier's voice lacked heat. He sounded more tired than angry. "I know you can, but there is no shame in accepting help when you need it." Emma poured coffee for both of them, then set out the bread and dried meat she had brought for lunch. "Tell me about the mining camp." Jacob's telegram did not give me much detail. Xavier settled into the chair with visible relief. "Silver Strike about 6 months ago, 15 miles west of here. Started with a few prospectors, now there are maybe 40 men working the area. Jacob runs the largest operation, has about a dozen men under him, and you supply them?" "Meat mostly. I hunt and they pay me in coin and supplies." Xavier took a sip of coffee. "It is good work. Better than trap lines alone. The furs do not bring what they used to anyway. Do you go down to the camp often?" "Once every week or two to deliver meat and pick up supplies." That is how I got into this situation. I was supposed to make a delivery the day after the bear attack. When I did not show up, Jacob got worried and came looking. Found me here, half out of my mind with fever. I ran him off at gunpoint. Emma's eyebrows rose. "You pointed a gun at a man who was trying to help you?" I was not exactly thinking clearly. Xavier had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "He left but sent that telegram to Roswell. I guess he figured a medical person might have better luck getting through my thick head. He was right." Emma studied Xavier's face, seeing the exhaustion still lingering despite the broken fever. "You need to rest more. Healing takes energy, and your body has been fighting infection for weeks. I have been resting. Lying in bed delirious with fever is not the same as actual rest." Emma stood, moving to the bed. "Come on, you are going to sleep properly for a few hours while I keep watch." Xavier started to protest, but Emma cut him off with a look. He sighed and stood, making his way to the bed. Emma noticed he moved a little easier than yesterday, the immediate pain of treatment starting to fade. That was a good sign. She sat in the chair by the window, her medical journal in her lap, and watched Xavier fall into a deep, healing sleep. Outside, the mountains blazed with autumn color, aspens turning gold against the dark green of pine. It was some of the most beautiful country Emma had ever seen. She understood now why Xavier had chosen to make his life here. The days fell into a rhythm. Emma woke each morning to find Xavier already awake, the two of them sharing coffee in the dawn light. She checked his wound twice daily, pleased to see steady improvement. The inflammation decreased, the stitches held clean, and new pink tissue began forming at the edges of the healing gash. Xavier was not an easy patient. He chafed at the restrictions Emma placed on him, tried constantly to do more than he should. But Emma had dealt with difficult patients before, and she was surprisingly adept at managing Xavier's stubbornness with a combination of firm instruction and logical argument. On the third day, Emma was changing Xavier's bandages when he said, "Tell me about Roswell. What do you want to know?" Emma concentrated on her work, making sure the new bandage sat properly. Everything. I have not been to a town in 5 years. Is it big? Not very. Maybe 300 people, a bit more when the ranchers and homesteaders come in from the surrounding areas. We have a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and my clinic. A few other businesses. Most people ranch or farm. You like it there? Emma considered the question. I do. The people are good for the most part. They trust me to take care of them, which is more than many places would offer a female medical practitioner. I have a small house that was my father's, a good practice. It is a good life, but, Xavier prompted, hearing something in her voice. Emma tied off the bandage and sat back. But sometimes I wonder what else is out there. I have lived in Roswell my entire life. My father was so protective after my mother died. I was not allowed to take risks or go anywhere he deemed too dangerous. Then he died and I had to take over his practice, and that meant staying put, being responsible. I am not complaining. I love what I do. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to just go somewhere, see something new. The mountains are new. They are. Emma smiled. This is the farthest from Roswell I have ever been, actually. It is exciting and terrifying at the same time. Xavier's expression was thoughtful. You are braver than you think. What makes you say that? You rode 3 days alone into the mountains to treat a man you had never met, who had already run off one person at gunpoint. That takes courage. Xavier held her gaze, his pale blue eyes intense. You are not afraid of much, are you? I am afraid of plenty, Emma admitted, but I learned from my father that fear should not stop you from doing what needs to be done. People need medical care whether I am scared or not. They talked more that day than they had since Emma arrived. She told him about growing up in Roswell, learning medicine from her father, the challenges of being a woman in a profession dominated by men. Xavier shared stories of his years in the mountains, the harsh winters and beautiful summers, the wildlife he had encountered, the simple satisfaction of living by his own skill and strength. Emma found herself drawn to Xavier in a way she had not expected. He was unlike anyone she had known in Roswell. There was a quiet strength to him, a self-possession that came from years of surviving alone in unforgiving country. But there was also a gentleness that surprised her, evident in the way he moved around the cabin, in the care he took with his few possessions, in the way he listened when she spoke. On the 5th day, Emma noticed Xavier watching her as she prepared their breakfast. When she met his eyes, he did not look away. What? She asked. You are different from what I expected when I heard a doctor was coming from Roswell. What did you expect? An old man. Gray beard, gruff manner. Someone who would lecture me about mountain living and insist I come down to civilization. Xavier paused. Not a young woman who rides alone into dangerous country and tells me off for being stubborn. Emma felt warmth rise in her cheeks. Is that a compliment or a criticism? A compliment. Xavier's voice was soft. Definitely a compliment. The air between them shifted, something unspoken passing in the look they shared. Emma turned back to the stove, her heart beating faster. She had not expected this complication. She was here to treat a patient, not to develop feelings for him. But feelings were developing nonetheless, despite her better judgment. She found herself looking for excuses to be near Xavier, to touch his arm when checking his wound, to sit close when they shared meals. She noticed things about him that had nothing to do with medicine. The way his hair fell across his face when he leaned forward, the rare smile that transformed his serious expression, the deep timbre of his voice in the quiet cabin. On the 6th day, Emma was outside gathering firewood when she heard a commotion from inside the cabin. She dropped the wood and ran, pushing through the door to find Xavier struggling with something in the corner. What happened? She demanded. Rat got into the supplies. Xavier was trying to move a heavy box with his good arm, his injured shoulder preventing him from properly lifting it. Need to get this sealed better before it ruins everything. Let me help. Emma moved to his side and together they shifted the box. Sure enough, a large rat scurried away into a crack in the wall. Emma examined the supplies, relieved to find minimal damage. I should have been more careful, Xavier said, frustration evident in his voice. This would not have happened if I could use both arms. The supplies are fine, and you will be able to use both arms soon enough. Emma turned to face him and realized how close they were standing, barely a foot apart in the small space. She could see the individual strands of gold and brown in his hair, smell the clean scent of pine soap he had washed with that morning. Xavier's good hand came up slowly, as though he was giving her time to move away. When she did not, his fingers brushed her cheek, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was gentle, hesitant, completely at odds with his rough appearance. Emma, he said, her name a question. She should step back. She should maintain professional distance. She should remember that she was his doctor and this was inappropriate. Instead, Emma found herself leaning into his touch, her eyes closing briefly at the warmth of his palm against her face. "This is complicated," she whispered. "I know." Xavier's thumb traced along her cheekbone. "I have not been around people in so long. I do not know how to do this anymore. But when I look at you, something that has been frozen in me for years starts to thaw." Emma opened her eyes, seeing vulnerability in Xavier's expression that she suspected few people ever witnessed. This strong, self-reliant man who needed no one was looking at her like she was something precious and terrifying all at once. "I feel it too," she admitted. "I have been trying not to, but I do." Xavier's hand slid to the back of her neck, drawing her closer. Emma's hands came up to rest his chest, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt, the steady beat of his heart. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and questioning, a kiss that asked permission even as it was happening. Emma answered by pressing closer, her fingers curling into his shirt. The kiss deepened, Xavier's arm wrapping around her waist to pull her against him. Emma had been kissed before, brief fumbling encounters with boys from Roswell, who saw her as a curiosity more than a person. This was nothing like those awkward moments. This was fire and need and connection, Xavier kissing her like she was air, and he had been drowning. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I should not have done that," he said. "Why not?" "Because you are leaving. Because I live alone in the mountains and you have a life in Roswell. Because this cannot go anywhere." But even as he said it, Xavier's arm tightened around her waist, contradicting his words. "Maybe it cannot," Emma agreed. "But does that mean we should not feel what we feel?" Xavier pulled back enough to meet her eyes. "What do we feel?" "I do not know yet, but I would like to find out." Emma touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "Would you?" Instead of answering, Xavier kissed her again, and Emma took that as a yes. They did not speak about it again that day, both of them seeming to need time to process what had happened. But everything had changed between them. The air in the cabin felt charged, every accidental touch sparking with awareness. When Emma changed Xavier's bandages, her fingers lingered on his skin. When they prepared meals together, Xavier found excuses to stand close, to brush against her. That night, lying on her bedroll by the fire, Emma stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of her feelings. She barely knew this man. A week ago, she had never met him. But something about Xavier called to parts of her she had not known existed. His strength, his vulnerability, the way he looked at her like she was the most fascinating thing he had ever encountered. In the darkness, Xavier's voice came soft from the bed. "Are you awake?" "Yes, come here." Emma hesitated only a moment before rising, crossing to the bed. Xavier shifted over, making room for her beside him. Emma lay down carefully, mindful of his injured shoulder. Xavier's good arm wrapped around her, drawing her against his chest. "Is this all right?" he asked. "Yes." Emma relaxed into his warmth, her head resting over his heart. "This is perfect." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, the boundaries between doctor and patient, between strangers and something more, dissolving in the mountain night. Emma woke to morning light streaming through the window, and Xavier watching her, his pale eyes soft. Morning. Xavier's hand moved through her hair, the gesture tender. "I have been lying here for an hour trying to figure out how to ask you to stay." Emma's heart jumped. "Stay? I know it is crazy. I know you have a life in Roswell, responsibilities. But these past days with you here, it has been like remembering what it is to be human instead of just surviving." Xavier's voice was raw with honesty. "I do not want you to leave." Emma sat up, her mind racing. "Xavier, I cannot just abandon my practice. People depend on me, I know. I am not asking you to abandon anything. He struggled for words. "I just needed you to know that I want you to stay. That if there were any way to make it work, I would." Emma looked around the cabin, thinking about what Xavier was really asking. Could she live here in these mountains, isolated from everything she knew? Could she give up her practice, her home, her life in Roswell? But then she thought about the past week, the connection she had found with this complicated man, the way the mountains had called to something in her soul. She thought about her earlier admission that she wondered what else was out there beyond Roswell's boundaries. "What if I came back?" she said slowly. Xavier's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "What if I went back to Roswell, settled my affairs, and then came back here? Not permanently, not at first, but to visit, to spend time with you, to see if this thing between us is real or just the circumstances of being isolated together." Emma took his hand. I could make arrangements for someone to cover my practice periodically. There is a retired doctor in Santa Fe who owes me a favor, and the mining camp needs regular medical visits anyway. I could come once a month, stay for a week or two. Hope flickered in Xavier's eyes. You would do that? I think I would. Emma was surprising herself, but it felt right. I cannot promise anything long-term, but I want to see where this goes. Do you? Yes. Xavier pulled her down for a kiss, and Emma could feel his smile against her lips. Yes, I do. They spent the rest of that day making plans. Xavier would continue his work supplying the mining camp, which would give him income and regular contact with the outside world. Emma would return to Roswell, arrange for periodic coverage of her practice, and come back in 4 weeks. The mining camp would provide a base for her visits, where she could offer medical services to the miners while spending time with Xavier. On the 8th day, Emma removed Xavier's stitches. The wound had healed beautifully, new pink scar tissue forming a clean line where the bear's claws had torn flesh. Xavier would have limited mobility for a few more weeks, but the danger had passed. You are officially recovered, Emma announced, applying a final light bandage. Though you still need to avoid heavy lifting and give that shoulder time to fully heal. I know, I have a good doctor. Xavier caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. Thank you, Emma, for everything. You are welcome. Emma felt tears prick her eyes, surprising herself. She was not normally emotional about patients, but Xavier had become so much more than that. The next morning, Emma prepared to leave. She packed her medical bag, checked her horse's tack, and tried to ignore the ache in her chest at the thought of riding away from this cabin. From Xavier, he walked her outside, standing close as she mounted her horse. The October morning was crisp and clear, the mountains brilliant with fall color. 4 weeks, Xavier said, looking up at her. 4 weeks, Emma confirmed. I will be back before the first snow if I can manage it. Ride safe. The trail can be dangerous. I will be careful. Emma leaned down, and Xavier met her halfway for one last kiss. It was bittersweet, full of promise and uncertainty. As Emma rode away, she turned back once to see Xavier standing outside his cabin, watching her go. He raised his hand in farewell, and Emma returned the gesture before guiding her horse down the mountain trail. The 3-day ride back to Roswell gave Emma plenty of time to think. Was she being foolish? Was this just infatuation born of unusual circumstances? But every time she questioned herself, she remembered the way Xavier looked at her, the feeling of rightness she had experienced in his arms, the sense of possibility that had opened up in her heart. She reached Roswell in the late afternoon of the 3rd day, riding down the main street toward her small house and clinic. Several people called out greetings, asking about her trip. Emma assured them all had gone well and promised to share details later. Right now, she needed to think, to plan, to figure out how to make her promise to Xavier a reality. The retired doctor in Santa Fe, Dr. Harrison, was indeed willing to help. Emma sent him a telegram the next day, and he replied that he could cover her practice 1 week per month in exchange for a modest fee and a place to stay. It was more than fair, and Emma accepted immediately. Over the next 3 weeks, Emma threw herself into work, treating patients and preparing for her absence. She stocked supplies, organized her medical notes, and made sure Dr. Harrison would have everything he needed. She also bought supplies for the mountains, warmer clothing, better camping equipment, additional medical supplies that the mining camp might need. The townspeople noticed the change in her. Emma had always been competent and professional, but now there was a lightness to her, an excitement that had not been there before. When her friend Margaret, who ran the general store, asked what had happened in the mountains, Emma just smiled and said it had been an interesting trip. 4 weeks to the day after she left Xavier's cabin, Emma set out again, her horse loaded with supplies. The weather had turned colder, winter approaching rapidly in these high elevations. Emma pushed hard, making the journey in just over 2 days this time, familiar now with the trail. She reached Xavier's cabin as the sun was setting on the 2nd day, her heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. What if he had changed his mind? What if the past month had made him realize this was a mistake? But when Xavier stepped out of his cabin at the sound of her horse, the smile that broke across his face erased all her doubts. He strode toward her, and Emma barely had time to dismount before he was pulling her into his arms, kissing her with a fierceness that stole her breath. "You came back," he said against her lips. "I said I would. I know, but I was afraid you might reconsider, that you would realize I was asking too much." Xavier pulled back to look at her, his hands cupping her face. "God, I missed you. I missed you too." Emma laughed, giddy with relief and happiness. "Show me how your shoulder healed." Inside the cabin, Xavier stripped off his shirt, revealing the scar Emma's stitches had left. The line was neat and clean, the tissue healing perfectly. He could move his arm through a full range of motion now, though Emma noticed him favoring it slightly with heavy movements. "It looks excellent," she said, running her fingers over the scar. "You healed well. I had a good teacher." Xavier caught her hand, lacing their fingers together. "How long can you stay?" 10 days. Dr. Harrison is covering my practice." Emma smiled at Xavier's obvious pleasure. "I also brought supplies for the mining camp. I thought I could set up a temporary clinic there, offer medical services while I am here. They would appreciate that." Jacob mentioned several men dealing with injuries and illness. Xavier pulled her close again, seeming unable to stop touching her, as though he needed to confirm she was real. "But tonight you are staying here with me." Emma had no objection to that plan. They made dinner together, falling easily back into the rhythm they had established during her first visit. But this time there was no uncertainty, no professional distance. Xavier touched her freely, his hands on her waist as she cooked, his lips on her temple as they sat by the fire. That night, Emma did not even pretend she would sleep by the fireplace. She joined Xavier in his bed, and they held each other in the darkness, talking softly about the month they had spent apart. Xavier told her about returning to work, about checking his trap lines and hunting for the mining camp. Emma shared stories from her practice, the births and illnesses and small dramas of Roswell life. "Do you think you could be happy here?" Xavier asked as Emma drifted toward sleep. "Eventually, I mean, if this works out between us." Emma considered the question seriously. "I do not know yet. I love my work in Roswell, but I also love being here with you. Maybe the answer is not one or the other, but something in between. I have been thinking about it. The mining camp needs a regular doctor. What if I split my time? Half in Roswell with Dr. Harrison covering when I am gone, half here providing medical services to the camp and being with you." Emma lifted her head to look at Xavier. It would be unconventional, but it might work. Xavier's expression was thoughtful. "That is a lot of traveling. The trail between here and Roswell is not easy, especially in winter." "I know, but I rode it twice already and I can do it again, and maybe sometimes you could come to Roswell with me, see what the town is like." Emma traced patterns on Xavier's chest with her fingertips. "I am not asking you to give up your life here. I am just asking if you are willing to be flexible, to meet me halfway. I am willing to do anything that means I get to keep you in my life." Xavier's voice was fervent. "These mountains have been my sanctuary, but you, Emma, you are my home now." The words settled into Emma's heart, warm and solid. She kissed Xavier, pouring all her feelings into it, and he responded with equal passion. They made love that night, tender and exploratory, learning each other's bodies with careful attention. Xavier was gentle despite his strength, mindful of her inexperience, and Emma found herself lost in the intimacy of it, the profound connection that went beyond the physical. Afterward, wrapped in Xavier's arms with her head on his chest, Emma felt a peace she had never known. This was right. This was where she was meant to be, at least for now. The next morning, Emma rode down to the mining camp with Xavier. It was a rough collection of tents and a few permanent structures, men working the silver claim with picks and pans. Jacob Hendricks, the foreman who had sent the telegram, was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s with a thick beard and kind eyes. "So you were the doctor who finally got through Xavier's thick skull," he said, shaking Emma's hand with a grip that was firm but not crushing. "We are grateful. He is too valuable to lose to stubbornness. I was happy to help." Emma looked around the camp. "I brought medical supplies and I am here for 10 days. I would be glad to offer medical services to your men if needed." Jacob's face lit up. "That would be wonderful. We have several men with injuries that need looking at, and it would be good for everyone to have a checkup. Let me set you up in the mess tent. It is the biggest space we have." Emma spent the next week splitting her time between the mining camp and Xavier's cabin. During the days, she treated miners for everything from minor cuts to a badly set broken finger that needed to be rebroken and splinted properly. In the evenings, she returned to Xavier, and they would make dinner together, talk by the fire, and fall asleep in each other's arms. It was a glimpse of what their life together could be like, and Emma found herself falling more in love with Xavier with each passing day. She loved his quiet strength, his dry sense of humor, the way he listened when she talked about her work. She loved how he moved through the wilderness with confidence and grace, how he could track animals and read weather patterns and survive in conditions that would kill most men. Xavier, in turn, seemed to bloom under Emma's presence. He smiled more, talked more, opened up about his past in ways Emma suspected he never had with anyone else. He told her about his childhood on the Missouri farm, his time in the war, the slow process of healing that had brought him to these mountains. "I thought I would die alone up here," he admitted one night. "And I was all right with that. It seemed fitting somehow. But now with you, I realize I do not want to die alone. I want to build something, have a future, maybe even a family someday." Emma's heart swelled at the words. "Is that a proposal?" Xavier laughed, a deep rumbling sound that Emma loved. "Not yet. We have known each other 6 weeks, Emma. I am not that impulsive, but it is a declaration of intent. When the time is right, when we have figured out how to make this work, I intend to marry you. If you will have me." "I will have you," Emma said softly. "When the time is right." The 10 days passed too quickly. Before Emma knew it, she was preparing to leave again, packing her medical bag and saying goodbye to the miners who had become her patients. Jacob paid her generously for her services and made her promise to return. "You have been good for Xavier," he said quietly. "I have known him 5 years, and I have never seen him like this, happy, connected. Thank you for that. He has been good for me too," Emma replied honestly. The goodbye with Xavier was harder this time. Now they both knew what they had, what they were building together, and the separation felt more acute. "1 month," Xavier said, holding her close. "Come back in 1 month. I will. I promise." Emma kissed him, trying to memorize the feel of his arms around her, the warmth of his body. "Stay safe. Do not get into any more fights with bears. I will do my best." Xavier managed to smile, but his eyes were sad. "Ride carefully. The weather is getting colder." Emma made the trip back to Roswell in good time, though she encountered the first snow of the season on the second day. It was light, just a dusting that made the landscape beautiful, but did not impede her progress. She reached home safely and threw herself back into work, missing Xavier, but sustained by the knowledge that she would see him again soon. The pattern continued through the winter. Emma traveled to the mountains once a month, staying for a week or sometimes 2, providing medical services to the mining camp and spending her free time with Xavier. The trips became easier as she grew more familiar with the trail, and Xavier taught her winter survival skills that made the journey safer even in harsh weather. In Roswell, Dr. Harrison proved to be an excellent addition to the practice. The townspeople liked him, and he was skilled enough to handle most medical issues that arose during Emma's absences. Emma found she did not worry as much about leaving, trusting that her patients would be well cared for. Spring came to the mountains in a rush of melting snow and wildflowers. On one of her visits in April, Emma and Xavier took a long walk through the wilderness, following a trail that wound up to a high meadow filled with columbines and Indian paintbrush. "I have been thinking," Xavier said as they sat on a sun-warmed rock overlooking the valley below, "about what you said about building a life between here and Roswell. Yes, what if we made it more permanent? Not your arrangement, but us." Xavier turned to face her, taking her hand. "Emma May, I love you. I have loved you since you rode into these mountains with your medical bag and your stubborn determination to save my life. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you, whatever shape that life takes." Emma's breath caught. They had been together 6 months now, had learned each other's rhythms and quirks and dreams. She knew Xavier's morning grumpiness and how he liked his coffee. She knew he sang quietly when he thought no one was listening, and that he was afraid of nothing except losing the people he cared about. She knew he was kind and strong and honorable, that he would protect her with his life and respect her independence at the same time. "I love you too," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Xavier. Yes, I will marry you." Xavier pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a joy that made Emma's heart soar. They stayed in that meadow for hours, talking about their future, making plans, dreaming together about the life they would build. They married in June of 1880 in Roswell, with the whole town turning out for the celebration. Xavier endured the crowds and attention with good humor, though Emma could see the strain it put on him, but he also charmed the townspeople with his quiet strength and obvious devotion to Emma, and by the end of the night, even the most skeptical had to admit they made a good match. After the wedding, they returned to the mountains, to Xavier's cabin, which was now their cabin. Emma continued to split her time between Roswell and the mining camp, though she spent more time in the mountains now that she was married. Dr. Harrison took on a larger role in the Roswell practice, eventually becoming a full partner. The mining camp grew into a small town over the next few years, and Emma established a permanent clinic there, spending 3 weeks out of every month providing medical services, while Xavier continued his hunting and guiding work. They built a larger cabin near the mining camp, though they kept Xavier's original place as a retreat, somewhere to go when they needed solitude and peace. In 1882, Emma gave birth to their first child, a son they named Samuel. He had Xavier's pale blue eyes and Emma's stubborn determination, and from his first breath he seemed at home in the mountain air. Xavier was a devoted father, gentle and patient with the baby, and Emma fell in love with him all over again watching him care for their son. 2 years later, their daughter Clara arrived, dark-haired and fierce like her mother. Then came another son, Thomas, in 1886. The cabin that had once housed a solitary mountain man now rang with children's laughter and the chaos of family life. Emma continued her medical practice, training 2 young women from the mining camp town as nurses to assist her. She became known throughout the territory as an excellent practitioner, and people came from miles around to seek her care. Xavier expanded his work as well, guiding hunting and fishing expeditions for wealthy visitors from the east who wanted to experience the wilderness. They built a good life together, neither one giving up who they were, but instead finding ways to blend their dreams and goals. Emma never stopped missing the thrill of traveling between worlds, and Xavier never lost his love of the wild places. But together they created something neither could have managed alone. On a summer evening in 1890, 10 years after they first met, Emma and Xavier sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Their children played in the yard, Samuel teaching his younger siblings to identify animal tracks the way Xavier had taught him. "Do you ever regret it?" Xavier asked, taking Emma's hand. "Leaving Roswell, splitting your life between worlds?" Emma considered the question, looking at the life they had built, the cabin that was too small but filled with love, the practice that kept her challenged and engaged, the children who were growing up wild and free in these mountains, the man beside her who had taught her what it meant to truly be loved. "Not for a single moment," she said. "This is exactly where I am meant to be." Xavier squeezed her hand, that rare smile crossing his face. "I rode into your life bleeding and stubborn, convinced I did not need anyone. You proved me wrong." "You rode into my life?" Emma laughed. "I rode into the mountains with a medical bag, determined to save a foolish man who would not let anyone touch his wound. Lucky for me you did." Xavier pulled her close, kissing her temple. "That mountain man did not know what he needed until you showed up and changed everything." "We changed everything together," Emma corrected. "That is how it works. 2 people meeting, making room for each other, building something new." As the sun set and the stars emerged overhead, the family gathered on the porch. Samuel entertained his siblings with stories of mountain lions while Clara pestered Xavier for tales of the war, which he deflected with practiced ease. Thomas, still small, climbed into Emma's lap and fell asleep to the sound of his father's voice and the mountain wind through the pines. Emma looked at Xavier over their son's dark head and saw her whole world reflected in his pale eyes. The lonely mountain man and the determined doctor had found each other in the wild places and made a home. They had faced down death and distance and all the obstacles that should have kept them apart. And in the end, love had been enough. It was not the life Emma had imagined when she first rode into these mountains, with nothing but her medical bag and her determination. It was better. It was real and messy and full of challenges, but it was theirs, built on the foundation of a bear attack and stubborn pride, grown into something beautiful through patience and compromise and deep, abiding love. Xavier caught her looking and smiled, that private smile he saved just for her. Emma smiled back, her heart full to bursting with gratitude for the telegram that had brought her into these mountains, for the wounded man who had needed her, for the life they had built together among the peaks. The children eventually went to bed, protesting but tired from a day of mountain adventures. Emma and Xavier remained on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cool night air, watching the stars wheel overhead. "Tell me again," Emma said softly. "About the day I arrived. You really want to hear that story again?" But Xavier was already pulling her closer, his voice dropping into the storytelling cadence she loved. "There I was, bleeding and fevered and convinced I could handle it alone. Too stubborn for my own good, my shoulder rotting from bear claws I was too proud to admit had bested me. And then I heard a horse approaching. What did you think when you saw me? I thought you were a mirage. The fever had me seeing things by then. A woman alone, riding into my mountains like she owned them, with a medical bag and this look on her face that said she was not taking no for an answer." Xavier chuckled. I tried to send you away, remember? You did. You failed spectacularly. Best failure of my life. Xavier kissed the top of her head. You saved my life that day, Emma. Not just from the infection, but from the half-life I had been living up here. You reminded me what it was to be fully human, to connect with another person, to love and be loved. Emma turned in his arms to look at him properly. Even after 10 years, Xavier still took her breath away. His hair was longer now, touched with silver at the temples. The mountains had weathered his face, but his eyes were still that startling pale blue. Still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world. You saved me too, she said. I was so focused on duty and responsibility that I had forgotten to live. You taught me it was okay to want things for myself, to take risks, to build a life that did not fit anyone else's expectations. We saved each other then. Xavier cupped her face in his hands, those hands that were equally skilled at tracking game and cradling their children, at building shelters and stitching up the wounds Emma's medical practice sometimes gave him. Still saving each other every day, always. Emma agreed and kissed him under the mountain stars. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges. The mining camp town grew into a proper settlement with a school and a church and regular stagecoach service. Emma's clinic expanded, and she trained several more nurses, building a network of medical care throughout the mountain region. Xavier's guiding business thrived, and he became known throughout the territory as the best guide available. Able to lead expeditions safely through the wildest country, their children grew strong and capable. Samuel became a doctor like his mother, studying in Denver before returning to join Emma's practice. Clara developed a gift for languages and became a teacher, helping immigrant families who moved to the area for mining work. Thomas followed his father's path, becoming a guide and woodsman, equally at home in the wilderness. Emma and Xavier grew old together in their mountain home, watching grandchildren play in the same yard where their children had played. They never lost the connection that had sparked in those first desperate days when Emma fought to save Xavier's life. If anything, it deepened, becoming something so fundamental that neither could imagine life without the other. On a spring morning in 1910, Emma woke in their bed to find Xavier watching her, just as he had done that first morning after they acknowledged their feelings for each other. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning, love." Xavier touched her face, his fingers gentle despite the arthritis that had begun to make his hands stiff. "I was just thinking about the day we met. Were you?" Emma smiled. "What about it?" "About how close I came to dying alone in that cabin. About how you rode into my life and changed everything." Xavier's pale eyes, still sharp despite his 70 years, held hers. "About how lucky I am that a bear decided to take a piece out of me." Emma laughed, the sound bright in the morning quiet. "Only you would consider a bear attack lucky. It brought me you. That makes it the luckiest day of my life." Xavier pulled her close, and Emma settled into his arms, thinking about the long road they had traveled together. 30 years of marriage, 3 children, 7 grandchildren so far, and a life richer than either of them had dared to imagine in those early days. "I love you," she said, as she had said countless times over the decades. It never got old, never stopped meaning everything. "I love you too," Xavier replied, his voice warm with all the years and experiences they had shared. "My stubborn doctor who rode into the mountains and saved a foolish man's life. My mountain man who learned to let someone past his walls." Emma kissed him softly. "We made a good life, did we not?" "The best life." Xavier held her close, and they watched the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold, the same mountains that had witnessed their first meeting, their courtship, their life together. Emma thought about the young woman she had been, riding alone into dangerous country with nothing but determination and a medical bag. She had been so sure of her purpose, so focused on her duty. She could never have imagined the life that awaited her, the love that would transform everything she thought she knew about herself. And Xavier, the wounded mountain man, who had isolated himself from the world, who had believed he needed no one and nothing beyond his own strength in the wilderness. He had been wrong, and Emma had shown him just how wrong. Together they had built something neither could have created alone. It was a love story written in mountain stone and wilderness sky, in the blood and fever of that first desperate meeting, in the steady accumulation of days and years spent side by side. It was a story of 2 stubborn people who had learned to bend, to compromise, to make space for each other while remaining wholly themselves. It was, Emma thought as she held her husband and watched the mountains wake to a new day, the best story she had ever been part of. And though they were both growing old, though their children were grown and starting families of their own, the story was not over yet. There were still mornings to wake in each other's arms, still sunsets to watch from the porch, still quiet moments of connection that made every challenge worthwhile. The mountain man and the doctor, the wounded man and the woman who had ridden alone into dangerous country to save him. It should not have worked by any practical measure. But love rarely cared about practical measures. It cared about connection and courage, about two people willing to risk everything for the possibility of something extraordinary. They had found that extraordinary thing, against all odds, in the wild mountain country where Emma had first carried her medical bag and Xavier had finally let someone touch his wound. And they had held on to it, nurtured it, let it grow into something that sustained them both through 3 decades of life together. As the sun cleared the peaks and flooded their bedroom with light, Emma heard the sounds of their family beginning to stir. Samuel would be arriving soon with his wife and children for Sunday dinner. Clara was coming down from the schoolhouse, she ran. Thomas was bringing his new bride to meet the extended family. Their home would soon be full of noise and laughter and life. But for this moment, Emma and Xavier remained in their quiet bubble, holding each other as they had for 30 years, grateful for the bear attack that had brought them together, for the stubbornness that had led Emma into the mountains, for the love that had made everything else possible. "Ready to face the day?" Xavier asked. "With you? Always." Emma kissed him once more, then rose to begin their morning routine. Together, they moved through the familiar steps, preparing for the family gathering, for another day in the life they had built together. And as Emma watched Xavier move around their home, still strong despite his years, still the mountain man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, she felt nothing but gratitude. For the telegram that had sent her into the wilderness, for the wounded man who had needed her, for the courage to build a life that defied conventional expectations. She had rode into the mountains with a medical bag, determined to help a man who had refused treatment for weeks. She had found her purpose, her partner, her home. And she would do it all again in a heartbeat, because the mountain man and his doctor had created something beautiful together, a love that had lasted through decades and would continue until their final days. That was their story, written in the mountain stone and the changing seasons, in the children and grandchildren who carried their legacy forward, in the life they had built together through stubbornness and compromise and deep, abiding love. And it was perfect, exactly as it was meant to be.